Thank you for joining us for Trafficking in America Now. We're a weekly television program dedicated to bringing awareness on human trafficking in Nashville, Tennessee, Davidson County, Tennessee, the state, and across America. We do this on a weekly basis. It's shown 3 times a week. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time, we thank you and we welcome you to contact us. We'll have that information up at the end of the program. But we have guests on every week that talk about anything connected to human trafficking, whether it's survivors, whether it's talking about pornography, whether it's talking about legislation, anything connected to the issue of human trafficking, we try and address on this program. This week we have a wonderful guest, actually a dear friend of mine who I met when we first began this work. Her name is Derri Smith, and she is the founder, executive director of End Slavery Tennessee. And Derri's going to tell us a lot about her organization, how she got involved in human trafficking to begin with, and it's going to be a very enlightening show. She's done a lot in a very short time period. So Derri, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
I'm so happy to have you here. I've been wanting to have you on for a while, so I'm glad that we had the time to do this. Tell us, who is Derri Smith?
Well, first and foremost, I'm a wife and a mother.
Mm-hmm.
I've been married to the love of my life, Bill Smith, for 39 years. I have 2 beautiful daughters. One's about to be 25 and the other is 20. And the rest of my life is pretty much devoted to ending human trafficking and creating a slave-free Tennessee.
Wonderful, wonderful. That is admirable to begin with, that you're dedicating your whole life to do this for the remainder of your life. And we so value that service attitude that you have. Tell us, to begin with, we always get this question, as you know, as NGOs, how did you get inspired to work in human trafficking, anti-human trafficking? Tell us, what got you connected to the issue of human trafficking?
When I look back at my life, I think of it as a dot-to-dot picture. And sometimes when you're younger, you look at the dots and think, what is that about, God? I don't understand what's happening. But as I look back from 58, I see that everything in my life has prepared me for this cause. I have been a public school teacher, and of course young people are vulnerable to this travesty. I headed an inner city ministry, and people in poverty and in the inner city are definitely a vulnerable population. I worked overseas with refugees from then communist Eastern Europe, again another very vulnerable population. I myself was a victim of child abuse in my home at the hands of my father, who was a pastor. So I spent many decades talking in the church about the issue of child abuse and crying with and informally counseling women who were victims of child abuse. So when the issue of human trafficking came across my radar, I was just reading a book on child abuse, and human trafficking was described. I was undone. I just started reading everything I could, talking to everyone I could. My husband would come home and find me in a pool of tears on the floor.
I can relate to
just
that.
dried up, overwhelmed by the horror of what people were undergoing. And so I have what my Jewish relatives call chutzpah, so, and I'm a little older, so I just started calling everybody I could find across the country who was working on this issue and saying, what can I do? What needs to be done? What's working? What doesn't work? And at that stage, there weren't that many people involved.
True.
And
when was that? How many years ago was that?
That was, I'd say maybe 7 years ago.
Okay.
And so I talked to some of the bigger groups that were involved, but primarily they were doing great work, but the answer I was hearing was give money.
Yes.
And of course I understand it takes money, but I needed to give myself. I needed more than that. And that's what led to me starting work here in Tennessee.
Do you mind if we go back a little bit to, you mentioned that you were a victim of child abuse at the hands of your father, who was a pastor.
Right.
Right. How did that affect your life as a youth and growing up before you got involved in missionary work and things of that nature?
You know, when you're a child, you don't know, it's not normal. Whatever happens in your life is normal to a child. And so it took a lot of years looking. I knew I didn't like it. I knew I didn't like what was going on. But we moved all the time. Just like in trafficking, we didn't have a support system. I didn't have people to talk to. So it made me, I think, confused and looking for love in all the wrong places, which I think happens to a lot of child abuse victims. just anywhere where I could get affirmation and affection, and even the fathering that I was longing for.
Sure. So that really does play a big part in what you're doing now then with sex trafficking victims, because you can relate to the trauma and the pain that they've been through.
I certainly haven't been through the same things, but it gives me a place of empathy, and it also helps me understand a little bit more about their thought processes, how they may not be thinking what seems normal to us. Gives me that insight, so that's a good thing.
So you have been prepared in a lot of ways because you were a missionary.
Yes.
And you have been with broken people most of your life, it sounds like.
Yes.
So you can relate. That, to me, is a prerequisite in really, really understanding the issue. Of course, you don't have to be a victim to understand and to empathize with people. I know that one of our goals in our organization is to inspire and mobilize people to do something once they learn about the issue of human trafficking. And obviously, you were inspired and took up the cause and went with it. So let's go to international teams. I think you started with international teams, right? That was your first venture out once you learned. Tell us about that.
Well, many years ago, my husband and I were missionaries with international teams, and I just was reading one of their newsletters one day, and they mentioned something about human trafficking. And so just a casual conversation started the ball rolling. Actually Bill wrote to the president and said, oh, we're so glad to hear that you're interested in this cause, and we're very interested too. And it started a series of conversation that led to him asking me to come on board and work with their teams around the world. They were working with vulnerable populations who were encountering trafficking, and they really wanted some help strategizing how to work with the victims they were coming across and how to develop human trafficking work. So I spent several years doing that, working globally with teams around the world. And that was very educational because I saw trafficking with its many faces and all the cultural issues that can tie into it.
Wonderful. So how long were you with international teams?
For 2 years.
2 years. So that was some valuable experience then, especially on a worldwide basis.
Yes.
Are all the countries, is the issue the same in all the countries, or did you see a variance in different countries as far as how it happened or how?
Well, at the core there are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences in the culture, in the mindset, in the ways that we need to address the issue. In some countries, I think it's just much more out in the open. If you go to Cambodia, you are going to see sex trafficking in your face, whereas in the United States, it tends to be more hidden. So those are some of the kinds of differences I see. Or in some cultures, buying sex is considered normal or even masculine rite of passage. And so all those kinds of cultural issues will affect what trafficking looks like.
Okay, wonderful. We're going to take a tiny little break and then watch a video and then come back and talk about End Slavery Tennessee, okay?
It's the largest human trafficking case in U.S. history. There were 29 people indicted for sex trafficking, including minors. And my role has been twofold, providing some holistic aftercare for the survivors, for the Jane Does, and also providing some expert witness testimony. It's a complex issue to begin with. They come from backgrounds that most of us in this privileged country can't really understand. People who've come from a war-torn nation, who have lived in refugee camps for years, who may not have documents. So on top of that, they're facing a horrendous crime allegedly done against them, and they have to go and speak in public about the horrors that were done to them, looking in the face of the alleged perpetrators, and on top of that, turning their back on their people and their culture. The people who have been indicted are from Somali gangs in Minneapolis and from Nashville. I have testified that it's very empowering to a survivor of human trafficking to have the choice of where and when to tell her story.
So let's go now to America. You worked across the world with international teams. Let's bring it home to America in Tennessee. You founded an organization, End Slavery Tennessee. Tell us how that started and briefly what End Slavery Tennessee is all about.
Okay. Even as I was working globally, my heart was always drawn to my own backyard. And I was appalled to find out that this wasn't just happening overseas, that this was happening right here in Nashville, right here in Middle Tennessee. And that indeed we were a hub for trafficking for many reasons. One of the primary ones is that we're at the intersection of 3 major interstates. And one of those interstates comes up from Atlanta,
Right.
which is one of the child sex trafficking hubs in the country. So we have a lot of victims who come up from Atlanta. In fact, I worked with a couple of girls not long ago who were trafficked from Atlanta, and in the car on the way up, the trafficker said, I'm going to make more money off of you in Nashville, so that's why I'm taking you there. So, you know, we have convention centers, we have tourists, we have a pretty good economy, we have just so many magnets for
The music
traffickers.
industry.
Yes, absolutely. Tourists, you know, all that kind of thing. When we have a new convention center coming in.
Oh, I know.
All of those are magnets for traffickers because there's going to be business.
Right.
And so as I learned that and I started hearing the stories of survivors in our own backyard, I was appalled and I had to do something. And I started asking around, and I was amazed that in this country with so many resources, how very little was being done at all to help those survivors. I just couldn't know that was happening in my backyard and not do something about it.
Good for you.
So I started by just doing what most people do, talking about it.
Right,
Yeah, I spoke at my church for a few minutes, said, let's have a meeting, and anyone who's interested, come and meet me later in the week, and I had 80 people show up, and that was
Wonderful.
really the beginning of this work. We still have people from that meeting who are volunteering with us. As that happened, our work developed to be more specialized in training certain professions to recognize and to get appropriate help for survivors. And from that, we started realizing that the same textbook tactics were being used by traffickers over and over again in the stories we were hearing and the survivors we were meeting. And so we moved into prevention, warning young people what those tactics were so we could empower them to avoid falling prey. And then as we built credibility and experience, law enforcement, people we trained who were spotting trafficking, people were starting to call on us to actually provide the direct help to survivors. And so that's what's really exploding in our work right now, just providing the long-term holistic help that a survivor needs to recover.
Wonderful. Well, let's talk about excuse me, statistics in Tennessee. You said you found it in our own backyard. Statistically, what's going on?
Well, we're very fortunate because the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation did some research. Most states don't have that kind of research.
Don't. You're right.
And they found that 85% of the counties had reported at least one case of human trafficking. A case can and usually does involve more than one person. 70-some% reported a case of minor sex trafficking.
And minor is what age group?
That's under 18.
Under 18, okay.
And I think every place I've gone, every law enforcement person I've talked to at the state, local, or federal level has said that is the tip of the iceberg. You know, we just don't have the resources, law enforcement isn't trained enough yet. For whatever reasons, we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg. In fact, one of the maps I found very interesting in the report was that human trafficking activity is larger scale than gang activity in our state.
Oh, wow, I was not aware of that. I know I went to a meeting not long ago about the gang activity, and I was blown away by that education, to know how much, especially in this area, is going on with the gangs. And I also learned, I think, and you can help me understand if this is accurate, that a lot of times the gang activity is related to human trafficking, and they're intertwined.
Very
is that
much
accurate?
So. Gangs will typically kidnap, recruit young girls, first to serve as the gang members free, and then to make money for the gang by selling them to others.
So they're the ones helping to draw them in.
Yes.
I think this figure was, what, 4,000 in the last 24 months in Tennessee was what TBI came up with. And again, tip of the iceberg.
Another statistic that really jarred me when I saw it was that of the runaways who are actually reported in our state, about 1,000 every year are trafficked.
I saw that on your site, and that also blew me away, that that's in addition to what we already know.
Yeah.
So Tennessee definitely has a problem that we need to address.
Very much so.
Legislatively, can we go there a minute, talk about the legislative laws in Tennessee and what we're doing to combat it from that standpoint?
Okay. We don't spearhead legislative work. Another organization in the state does, so we get behind them and follow them. But we have come such a long way. 4 years ago, we had, I think it was 2 of the 10 basic laws that are recommended by the Polaris Project. And we have 7 now.
Wonderful.
So we have made a lot of progress. We have some great legislators who work with us who are very much on board for trying to get the tools in place that we need legislatively. One of my favorites, I think, is just the fact that we have now made it not possible to charge a child with prostitution.
Yes, I love that.
yes.
I do. And I'm surprised that all states don't have that. I'm
It's-
learning that it's just what, I think 14 states have laws to protect the children or
Isn't
the
that
youth.
amazing?
It is amazing.
I mean, they're not
Absolutely
old enough
amazing.
to consent to sex, but
I
they're old
know.
enough to be charged with a crime.
Exactly.
And they're obviously a victim.
We definitely need to make some changes in this country regarding that issue. Let's go to training for a little bit. I know you do a lot of training. So tell us about your training programs and who you train and how that looks for End Slavery Tennessee.
We have a team of presenters who actually go out, who are trained on everything from Human Trafficking 101 to very specialized training. And just as by way of example, this week I'll be training youth villages, staff for youth villages. Next month I'll be training at a conference for juvenile judges. We've trained medical personnel, social workers, teachers, apartment managers, anyone who might either encounter a victim in their line of work or who might see the suspicious signs because they have entry into residences.
In regard to training, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation also trains, right? They're helping our law enforcement understand the issue?
Yes, thankfully they got a grant to be able to do that, and they do an excellent job, and of course they have great credibility.
They do.
So Margie Quinn and her team at TBI are doing a great job.
Yeah, let's applaud TBI. They do
Yes,
it famous.
wonderful.
I think they were the first we're the first state to actually conduct a comprehensive report
Yes.
on what the state's dealing with. We need to get all states to come along board and do the same thing.
Absolutely.
I think that would really help. Well, let's take just a short break right now. We'll be right back.
Good morning. Can you hear me? All right, good morning. We've been talking all weekend about the issue of human trafficking, and now I'd like to ask you to just pull up a mental image of a human trafficking victim, whatever pops into mind. Have something? Whatever you imagined is probably true, because victims can cross all socioeconomic lines, racial, ethnic, educational lines. They can be either gender, but in 50% of the cases globally, and some figures in the United States indicate higher, up to 71%, human trafficking victims do have one characteristic in common. They're very young, minors. So we're going to look in this session at how extensive the risk is for minors. We're going to look at the 5 most common tactics used by traffickers to lure their young victims with the goal in mind of preventing young people from being trafficked to begin with. Let me start by saying that determining the scope of trafficked youth has many obstacles. It's almost impossible. In most cases, this is a hidden crime, so it's not like flying over the Serengeti in an airplane counting elephants. Neither the perpetrators nor the victims are lining up to be counted. Why is that? Well, many victims are reluctant to testify against their controllers for fear of violence or even death, harm to their families. In too many cases, they, against all evidence to the contrary, believe that their traffickers are their boyfriends and they love them. In some cases, victims have never known any other life. This is what seems normal to them, and they don't even recognize themselves as victims. Many youth-serving agencies, in order to protect their clients' confidentiality, don't even ask questions about this topic. There are laws in place to protect the privacy of children that make tracking difficult. Training and communication is often inadequate between law enforcement, juvenile justice, and social service providers. So all of those factors work together to make it really difficult to capture the whole picture. And yet, even with what we do know, the picture that's painted is appalling. So in 2006, Shared Hope International received a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice to do a field study on domestic minor sex trafficking, the sex trafficking of America's children. Here's a quote from that report. American children are victims of sex trafficking within the United States. Domestic child victims tend to be easy targets and carry less risk for the traffickers and buyers than adults and foreign nationals. As transportation of human trafficking victims across borders becomes increasingly difficult and dangerous, The trend is to target children here in the United States. Now, 5 years later, that trend is clearly an epidemic. There's some old research by the University of Pennsylvania that at least 100,000 American children alone are used for pornography and prostitution every year. And that's an old figure. I'm sure it's higher than that by now. One survivor I talked to just verified that for me. She said minors just command higher prices for their controllers. In her case, it was about $400 every time she was sold. And human trafficking as a whole is just an epidemic. I'm sure you've heard this before, but human trafficking is the #2 and the fastest growing crime on the planet.
We've just watched a clip on Derri presenting at our 2011 conference, and you were one of our very first speakers at our conference, and did such a wonderful job. Thank you for doing that. I know training, we just talked about, and training is so important for you, and we also know that's so necessary in our culture right now in our country, because people, believe it or not, are still just now hearing about this and still don't believe it's going on. So from a training aspect, what do we really need to know as a public, as a community, regarding human trafficking?
I think it's amazing that if you look at news interviews, you'll see that trafficking will be uncovered, and invariably, for example, neighbors will say, oh, we thought something funny was going on. You know, there were men coming and going all hours of the day and night, or a child who never seemed to leave home. So the more we can train people to recognize the red flags, the signs of a trafficking survivor, and to know what to do, where to call, where to get help, the faster we're going to get people rescued. I was appalled this week to read an article in another state about a victim who had been held by a couple in their home for 19 years.
19 years.
19 years. And finally, somebody had a tip and got her rescued. We don't want it to take 19 years for somebody to be spotted and rescued. So training is just, I can't overemphasize how important it is.
I agree.
For one thing, it leads to those kinds of tips that lead to rescues. In fact, I had one this week. Somebody who received some training from us had a very detailed, very credible information that almost certainly is the trafficking of a minor, of a very young minor. And so we can give that to law enforcement then, and they can investigate, and we can get somebody rescued and helped.
So what would, I'm Jane Doe neighbor, you're my neighbor, we have youth in our area, our subdivision. What would we spot that might tip us that trafficking might be going on? What signs would we see?
Now, on the one hand, every case is different.
True.
So, you know, what you have in one case, you may not see in another one. So we do have a lengthy list of red flags on our website, which you'll put up later.
We will.
But, you know, some things you might notice is that there's a child who doesn't seem to leave the house. They're not just being homeschooled, they just don't leave. Or men coming and going at all hours of the day and night, different cars. You may spot somebody in that home who is afraid to make eye contact, or who never seems to be alone. Somebody is always supervising them. Somebody is doing the speaking for them. Sometimes they have branding, a tattoo that says daddy, for example.
Right.
Because
that
these
word, they use that
children
word a lot.
are required to call their controllers daddy in this kind of perverted family that they set up. It might be that they have very scripted sounding stories, or their stories are inconsistent from one time to another, or they're not even allowed to come out and talk. That's just the tip of the iceberg. But you might have, I know this sounds funny, but sex trafficking minors who are sex trafficking victims will invariably be texting or on the phone all the time. And that's kind of hard to tell from your normal teen anymore, but they're making contact with the pimp and with the clients.
Speaking of sexting, I heard a figure not long, actually it was just this week, that age 9, I think, is the average age for sexting now, and over 30% of the youth are sexting on their cell phones. So even as parents, we need to be more responsible, don't we, in regarding to what our children are doing and what the youth are doing.
And law enforcement tells me that these predators are looking for those kinds of signs. It tells them that those young people are vulnerable to the lures that they have for them.
So neighbors and we just need to be alert and try and get involved by even having conversations with our youth in our areas to see if they'll talk and just see what's going on.
Just being aware
just
of
being
the issue.
aware.
Because, you know, in the past, I think it didn't cross our radar to think, oh, I should pay attention. Those might be trafficking victims.
Might be. Again, our goal is to inspire and mobilize people to do something in their area. What would you say to the person watching this program whose heart's being ripped apart right now because they're understanding and seeing for the first time that this really is an issue in America and in our area of Nashville? What would you say to that person that wants to do something?
I would say that there is something for everybody. There is a way to use your skill, your sphere of influence, your experience, and to channel that into ending this travesty. And that just get your feet wet. You know, if you go to our website, we have lists of ways to get involved with volunteer groups, of projects that you can engage in. Just get your feet wet and find out, you know, I really can do something that's significant. And then all of us who work in this field, I'm sure, would be glad to help find ways for you to go deeper and find your niche.
Speaking of that, what is your website? We'll put it up.
It is endslaverytn.org.
Very simple. We'll put that on the screen at the end of the program and do that. And you started, like you said, just at your church, and you got people together and you just began to talk and brainstorm, and that's how yours really began.
Absolutely.
So they just need to talk and find out what's in their heart to do and do it.
Yes.
Right, okay. What is the Tennessee hotline number? We want to put that up? Let's see if we have it here. I did the same thing. Oh, okay. We do have a Tennessee hotline for people to call if you have a problem or you suspect that something's going on in your neighborhood. It's called Tennessee Human Trafficking Hotline, and the number is 855-558-6484. And you can call that 24/7. It's a free call. If you suspect something going on in your neighborhood, with your school friends, anybody, call that number and report it, and they will guide you through what information they need for you to give all the information that's necessary for them to start an investigation. Thank you, Derri, for being with us. It's so valuable.
My pleasure.
And you're coming back next week to talk about some more areas that you're working in Slavery, Tennessee. So we'll see you next week.
The moment she was born, her mommy and daddy cried, taken by the wonder of her life. From Barbie dolls to ballet shoes, from roller skates to lipstick and rouge, she's become a lady overnight. Why do I see only flesh and look right past her heart? I try to tell myself I can't help what I feel. Then I remember she's somebody's daughter, somebody's child, somebody's pride and joy.